The exoplanet was silent at night. Too silent. Darren Rains sat on the porch of his prefab cabin, a mug of something vaguely resembling coffee in his hands. His breath misted in the frigid air as he stared into the dark treeline. The wind howled, stirring the bioluminescent fungi that dotted the landscape, but beyond that, nothing. And that was what unsettled him. Since arriving on this planet 6 months ago, he'd come to recognize its patterns. The distant shrieks of the native wildlife, the rustle of unseen creatures skittering through the underbrush, even the occasional low rumble of a passing storm. But for the past few nights, something had changed. Something was watching him. It started with small things. His tools weren't where he'd left them. His external water filters, clogged and in need of cleaning, were mysteriously clear by morning. At first, he chalked it up to forgetfulness. But when he awoke one night to hear slow, deliberate footsteps outside his cabin, his instincts flared. Something or someone was out there. He hadn't come all the way to the edge of the known galaxy to die to some unseen stalker. So tonight he waited. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, blanketing the treeline in shifting shadows. Darren adjusted his grip on his old plasma rifle, its barrel resting lazily on his knee. He wasn't eager to kill anything, but he wouldn't hesitate if it came down to survival. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Just beyond the glow of his porch light, something massive shifted in the darkness. A towering silhouette, at least 10 feet tall, stood partially obscured behind a tree. His pulse quickened. The thing wasn't just big, it was watching him. "All right," he muttered to himself, setting his mug down. "Let's see what you are." Slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small drone, a simple reconnaissance unit. He activated it, and with a soft hum, it lifted into the air, scanning the dark. Its infrared sensors painted a rough outline of the figure, a humanoid shape, broad-shouldered, long-limbed. But as soon as the drone moved toward it, the shadow vanished. Darren cursed, gripping his rifle. He hadn't heard it move. No footsteps, no rustling brush. It was just gone. The fog swirled. He exhaled. Maybe it had been his imagination. Maybe. Then he heard it. A whisper. Not words. Not a growl. Something different. A soft, broken hum. Almost like a lullaby. Darren's blood ran cold. He wasn't alone out here. And whatever was watching him wasn't human. The humming drifted through the night air, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a chill down Darren's spine. He tightened his grip on the rifle, eyes scanning the foggy treeline where the towering figure had been only moments before. His drone hovered in place, its sensors struggling to lock onto anything in the shifting mist. Then, just as suddenly as the sound had appeared, it stopped. Silence. Darren's pulse pounded in his ears. If this thing had been watching him for days, maybe even weeks, why had it chosen tonight to make itself known? He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. If it had wanted to kill him, it had plenty of chances before now. The cleaned water filters, the tools put back in place. It didn't feel like the work of a predator. But that didn't mean it wasn't dangerous. Still, he needed answers. Carefully, he rose from his chair, keeping his rifle lowered but ready. He took a step forward, boots crunching on frost-covered soil. "All right," he called into the darkness. "I know you're out there." Silence. Another step. "You've been watching me, haven't you?" His voice was steady, though his nerves burned. "Hell, you've been helping me. So what is it? What do you want?" "Nothing. Just the slow swirl of fog and the distant glow of bioluminescent plants." Darren swallowed. "Maybe I imagined the whole damn thing." Then, a shadow shifted. To his left, just beyond the edge of the porch light, something massive stirred. The fog parted slightly, revealing a silhouette, a humanoid figure, impossibly tall and motionless. Darren's breath hitched. It wasn't running this time. It was waiting. Gritting his teeth, he took another step forward, the rifle still in his hands but held low. "Come on, then. Show me what you are." The figure hesitated. Then, slowly, it stepped into the light. Darren's grip tightened. It was a woman. or at least something close enough to resemble one. She was at least 10 feet tall, her body wrapped in tattered, form-fitting cloth that looked like the remnants of a once elegant uniform. Her skin was a deep, dusky blue, smooth but scarred, as if she had seen many battles. Her arms and legs were long and powerful, her movements strangely graceful despite her size, and her eyes large, luminous, glowing faintly with a soft violet hue, stared at him with a mix of wariness and something else, something almost hopeful. Darren felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He had seen aliens before, small, insectoid traders, reptilian scouts, even the occasional uplifted AI, but never anything like her. He swallowed hard. "You understand me?" The woman tilted her head slightly. A strand of dark, silken hair fell over her face. She didn't speak, but she didn't move away either. That was answer enough. Slowly, Darren lifted his hands, palms open, showing he wasn't a threat. The woman's eyes flickered to his rifle, then back to his face. "Right," he muttered, carefully setting the weapon on the porch beside him. No sudden moves. The tension in her stance eased just a fraction. Encouraged, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a ration bar. "Here," he said, holding it up. "You've been sneaking around my place for a while. Figured you might be hungry." The woman hesitated, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly. Then slowly she stepped forward. Darren had to fight the urge to take a step back. She was massive. Up close, the sheer size of her was overwhelming, her presence nearly suffocating. But she moved carefully, almost delicately, as if afraid of scaring him. Her long fingers reached out, brushing against his as she took the ration bar. Her skin was warm, warmer than he expected. She sniffed the food, then, after a moment of hesitation, took a cautious bite. Darren watched as her expression changed. First, confusion. Then, to his surprise, distaste. A quiet, almost imperceptible sound escaped her throat. Darren blinked. "Did you just—" He fought back a grin. "Did you just whimper?" The woman scowled, baring sharp canines, then tossed the remaining piece of the ration bar at his chest with surprising accuracy. Darren barely managed to catch it before laughing. "Yeah, I don't blame you. Tastes like cardboard." For a moment, she just stood there, studying him. Then, to his shock, the faintest trace of amusement flickered in her glowing eyes. Darren exhaled, the tension easing ever so slightly. Whoever she was, whatever she had been through, she wasn't just some mindless alien. She was someone. And for the first time since landing on this lonely, forgotten world, he wasn't alone. Darren had always thought of himself as a man who could handle isolation. 6 months alone on this rock had proved it. But now, standing before a 10-foot-tall alien woman with glowing violet eyes and an attitude, he realized something. Maybe he hadn't been as fine with solitude as he thought. She stood just beyond the glow of the porch light, her posture tense, arms crossed over her chest. The oversized ration bar incident was still fresh, and Darren swore she was still scowling at him for offering it in the first place. "All right," he sighed, leaning against the railing. "I get it. You don't like the food. Can't say I blame you." She didn't respond, at least not verbally, but the way her eyes flickered toward him, lingering for just a second longer than before, told him she was listening. Progress. He tapped his fingers against the wooden railing, thinking. If she had wanted to kill him, she would have done it already. That meant she was here for a reason. Maybe curiosity. Maybe necessity. Either way, she'd stuck around long enough to help with his supplies, to hum in the darkness, to watch. She wasn't just surviving. She was waiting. For what? Darren rubbed his face, exhaling. "You've been here longer than me, haven't you?" A flicker of movement, her weight shifting slightly. He took that as a yes. "How long?" he asked. "Weeks? Months?" No answer. But then, slowly, she raised her hand. She spread out her fingers once. Then again. And again. Darren frowned. 10-20. He did the math in his head. 30. She nodded. His stomach sank. 30 months. 2.5 years. She'd been alone here for 2.5 years. Darren's chest tightened. No wonder she was cautious. If she'd been surviving this long, avoiding whatever dangers lurked out there, he was probably the first sentient being she'd seen in ages. And he'd greeted her by pointing a damn rifle at her. He sighed. Guess I should have started with something other than a gun. Huh? To his surprise, she let out a quiet, amused huff. Not quite a laugh, but close. Another step forward. The light from his cabin touched her face now, revealing more than just her towering form. She was striking. Not human, not by a long shot, but there was something compelling about her. Her luminous eyes studied him like he was a puzzle she hadn't figured out yet. Darren hesitated, then reached down to the small wooden table beside him, grabbing his tablet. Okay, he said, activating the screen. If we're going to be stuck on this rock together, we should probably try and communicate. She tilted her head. He opened a simple language program, then pointed at himself. Darren. She stared at him. He tapped his chest. Darren, he repeated. Then, he gestured toward her expectantly. She frowned. Then, after a long pause, she let out a soft, guttural sound. Something deep, resonant, almost musical. It wasn't a word, not exactly. More like a name shaped into sound. Darren blinked. That, might be a little hard for me to say. She rolled her eyes. He smirked. All right. How about, I call you Sela? Her glowing eyes narrowed slightly, considering. Then, to his surprise, she gave a small nod. Progress. Darren grinned. Nice to meet you, Sela. She didn't return the smile, but she did step closer. Close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating off her in the cold night air. And just like that, the silence between them wasn't so heavy anymore. Hours later, Darren wasn't sure how long they sat there, exchanging gestures and broken attempts at understanding each other. But by the time the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon, he had learned a few things. 1. Sela was stronger than she looked. When he'd handed her an old wrench to test her grip strength, she had accidentally crushed it with one hand. 2. She had been here alone for far too long. Her body language, hesitant but eager, told him she wasn't just watching him out of necessity. She wanted to be near someone again. 3. She hated ration bars. With a passion. So you do eat, right? Darren asked, watching as she sniffed at the pile of packaged food he'd brought outside. Sela scoffed. Then, she made a sharp, snapping motion with her teeth and mimed tearing into something. Darren blinked. Meat? She nodded. Ha! He rubbed his jaw. I don't have much of that. Most of my supplies are processed. Sela frowned, then tapped her temple as if thinking. Then she stood up. Darren tensed as she moved past him, stepping into the fog beyond the cabin's edge. Wait! Where are you? A few minutes later, she returned, and in her massive hands, she carried a lifeless, four-legged alien creature. Its body still warm, its scales glistening. Darren just stared. Did you just go hunting in the middle of our conversation? Sela shrugged, tossing the carcass onto the ground like it was nothing. Darren exhaled. Right? Of course you did. Sela crouched beside the creature, then, without hesitation, ripped into it with her bare hands, peeling away the hide like it was tissue paper. Darren grimaced. Yeah, okay. That's nasty. Sela shot him a bemused look before tearing off a chunk of raw meat and popping it into her mouth. Darren gagged. I take it you don't cook your food? She raised an eyebrow. Then, almost mockingly, she picked up another piece of meat, held it up for him to see, then took an exaggerated bite, chewing slowly. Darren groaned. Oh, come on. That's just rude. To his complete and utter shock, Sela grinned. And just like that, Darren knew one thing for certain. This woman, this giant alien survivor, was going to drive him insane. But damn if he wasn't starting to like having her around. Darren had always known peace on this planet was a fragile thing. Even with Sela around, maybe because of her, he had felt it in his bones. A quiet unease, a pressure at the edges of his mind, like the calm before a storm. Tonight, that storm arrived. It started with a low hum in the distance, barely noticeable over the crackling fire where Sela was roasting some alien meat. thankfully at his insistence. Darren had been watching her, still getting used to the way she moved. Even sitting, she was enormous, her powerful arms resting on her knees as she turned the spit over the flame. She had warmed up to him over the past few days, her sharp features losing some of their wary tension, her glowing eyes carrying something softer. But as soon as the hum reached her ears, her entire body stiffened. Darren frowned. "You okay?" Sela didn't answer. Instead, she stood abruptly, her elongated fingers clenching into fists. And that was when Darren heard it too. A ship, not a distant freighter passing through the system. No, this sound was closer, low and pulsing, like a predator circling its prey. Darren's stomach twisted. No one was supposed to be out here. The only ships that came to this world were corporate supply vessels, and the next one wasn't scheduled for another 3 months. So who the hell? A spotlight flared to life in the sky, cutting through the fog like a blade. Darren's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a passing ship. Someone was searching for something. Or someone. His eyes flicked to Sela, whose entire body was coiled like a spring. Her gaze locked onto the light with a mixture of fear and fury. Darren's throat went dry. "It's them, isn't it?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to, because the look in her eyes told him everything. The people who had wiped out her species. The ones she had been running from for 2.5 years. They were here, and they weren't leaving without her. The descent. The ship loomed overhead, a sleek, menacing craft with angular plating and the unmistakable glint of high-powered weaponry along its hull. Darren swore under his breath. He had no idea who these bastards were, but judging by Sela's reaction, they weren't here to talk. He grabbed his rifle from the porch and turned to her. "We need to move." Sela hesitated, her fists still clenched. For a terrifying second, Darren thought she was going to fight instead of run. And maybe she could. Maybe she was strong enough to rip through whoever was coming. But he could see it, the fear she was trying to bury beneath her anger. She had survived this long by hiding. That wasn't an option anymore. Darren reached for her wrist. "Sela, move." That snapped her out of it. With a sharp nod, she turned and followed as he sprinted toward the treeline. Away from the cabin, away from the ship. They had no chance in an open fight, not against a fully armed crew. But if they could get to the caves near the ridge, they might have a shot at losing them. Behind them, the ship's engines roared as it descended. Darren risked a glance over his shoulder, just in time to see the first figures disembark. 3 of them, humanoid, but armored from head to toe in black tactical gear, weapons gleaming in the artificial light. They moved with brutal efficiency, scanning the area, their heads tilting as they communicated through unseen comms. One of them turned toward the fire. Darren barely caught the flicker of motion as the figure raised a sleek rifle. Fwash! A concussive blast tore through the air, obliterating the spot where they had been sitting only minutes before. Darren gritted his teeth. These guys weren't just tracking Sela. They were here to kill her. He ducked as another shot rang out, sending up a plume of dirt near his feet. They were closing in fast. Sela snarled, her entire body coiled with tension, but Darren grabbed her arm. "No, keep running." Her glowing eyes burned with frustration, but she didn't argue. They sprinted deeper into the forest, weaving through the thick, bioluminescent underbrush. The ground sloped downward as they neared the caves, a natural labyrinth of tunnels Darren had scouted weeks ago. If they could get inside, they might just have a chance. A second ship roared overhead. Darren's stomach dropped. There were more of them. A sharp crack split the air, and suddenly Sela staggered forward, her leg buckling. Darren spun, horror gripping his chest. She had been hit. A deep gash had been torn into her thigh, glowing violet blood dripping into the dirt. She gritted her teeth, pushing herself back up, but Darren could see the way her leg trembled. They weren't going to make it. Not like this. His mind raced. The mercenaries were too close. The ship overhead was searching. They needed a distraction. His eyes darted to the ridge. An idea formed. A stupid, reckless, desperate idea. He turned to Sela, pressing a hand against her shoulder. Get to the caves. Her eyes widened. She shook her head sharply. Darren forced a grin. Don't look at me like that. I'm not dying, just buying time. She didn't move. He exhaled. Then, before she could stop him, he grabbed the emergency flare from his belt, yanked the pin, and hurled it toward the opposite end of the forest. A brilliant red light flared through the darkness. The moment the mercenaries turned toward it, Darren fired. 2 quick plasma shots into the trees. Not at them, but close enough to make them think they were under fire. It worked. They shouted orders, their attention shifting toward the false threat. Darren turned back to Sela. Go. For a second, she just looked at him. Then, with one last glance, something raw, something terrifyingly real, she turned and vanished into the caves. Darren took a shaky breath. Then, gripping his rifle, he bolted in the opposite direction, leading the mercenaries away. The forest blurred around him, streaks of bioluminescent blue and green flashing past as he darted between twisted alien trees. His breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of his rifle bouncing against his chest. Behind him, the mercenaries were closing in. His plan had worked, kind of. The flare and gunfire had drawn their attention, but these guys weren't amateurs. They had already recalibrated, spreading out to cut him off. Darren slid behind a thick tree, pressing his back against the damp bark. His heart pounded in his chest. He could hear them, boots crunching against foliage, voices murmuring through comms. They were sweeping the area methodically, searching for him like wolves closing in on wounded prey. Just a little longer, he told himself. Just keep them busy long enough for Sela to escape. A shadow moved to his right. Darren sucked in a breath. One of the mercenaries was getting too close. He tightened his grip on his rifle. He wasn't a soldier, never had been. But he had spent enough time out here to know how to survive. Come on, you bastard. Just a little closer. The mercenary stepped forward, scanning the darkness. Their visor glowed faintly red as they turned toward him. Darren struck. He swung the butt of his rifle hard, slamming it into the merc's helmet. The soldier staggered with a grunt, and Darren seized the opening, driving his knee into their chest. They hit the ground, winded. Darren raised his rifle, aiming at their head. Then something slammed into his back. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding across his ribs as a second merc tackled him. Shit, Darren struggled, but the soldier was stronger, pinning him with brutal efficiency. A gauntlet hand wrapped around his throat, forcing his head into the dirt. A voice crackled through a helmet speaker. Target acquired. Darren coughed, trying to pry the fingers away. Hate to break it to you, he gasped, but I think you got the wrong guy. The soldier didn't respond. Instead, they twisted his arm behind his back, locking it in place with cold precision. Darren gritted his teeth. Damn it. He had led them away from Sela, but now he was well and truly screwed. Then, a new sound. A deep, guttural snarl. The mercenary stiffened. Darren barely had time to register what was happening before something huge erupted from the darkness. Sela. She hit them like a thunderstorm. One moment, the soldier was pressing Darren into the dirt. The next, they were flying through the air, crashing into a tree with bone-shattering force. Darren rolled onto his back, just in time to see her rip into the other merc, her massive hands wrapping around their helmet and slamming them into the ground. The sound was sickening. The remaining mercenaries scrambled backward, fumbling for their weapon. They raised their rifle. Sela grabbed them by the throat. Darren pushed himself up, chest heaving. Sela. She wasn't listening. Her violet eyes blazed with fury, her grip tightening around the struggling mercenary. They kicked and thrashed, but it was useless. She was done running, and Darren realized with a cold chill that she was about to kill them. His breath caught. He should let her do it. These bastards had hunted her for years. They would never stop. But if she crossed this line, if she gave in to that part of herself, there would be no going back. Sela. His voice was steady. Let them go. She didn't react. Darren swallowed hard. He stepped forward, ignoring the bodies, ignoring the way her muscles tensed like a drawn bowstring. He reached out, resting a hand on her arm. Sela. She froze. Her fingers twitched around the merc's throat. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she turned to look at him. Her breath was ragged, her pupils blown wide. The rage in her eyes was an inferno, raw and untamed. But then, something else flickered there. Recognition. Her grip loosened. The mercenary gasped for air, scrambling away like a wounded animal. They didn't hesitate. They ran. Sela let them. For a long moment, there was only silence. Darren exhaled, shoulders slumping. He turned to her, ready to speak. Then she staggered. His stomach lurched. He caught her before she collapsed completely, barely managing to keep her upright. Her wound, the gash in her thigh, was worse than he had realized, dark blood seeping between her fingers as she clutched at it. Darren gritted his teeth. "Damn it, Sela, you should have stayed hidden," she huffed weakly. "You talk too much." Darren blinked. Then, despite the situation, despite everything, he laughed. A short, breathless chuckle. Sela made a sound that might have been amusement or exhaustion. Maybe both. Darren tightened his grip around her, supporting her weight. "Come on, big girl. Let's get you patched up." She grunted in response, but didn't argue. Together, they stumbled toward the caves. The fight wasn't over. The mercenaries would be back. But for now, just for tonight, she was safe. And Darren? Darren wasn't alone anymore. Darren's breath came in ragged gasps as he half-carried, half-dragged Sela through the dense forest. Her massive frame leaned heavily against him, her strength failing with every step. The deep gash in her thigh oozed violet blood, leaving a glowing trail behind them. "Stay with me, big girl," Darren muttered, tightening his grip around her waist. "Just a little further." Sela grunted weakly, her usual sharp wit dulled by pain and exhaustion. Still, she pushed forward, forcing her injured leg to move. The cave entrance loomed ahead, a jagged opening in the mountainside, its depths swallowed in shadow. It was their only chance. Behind them, the sky still glowed with the mercenaries' shiplights, but the forest had swallowed their pursuers for now. The mercs wouldn't leave without their prize. They'd be back. But Darren had a plan. He just needed time. Inside the cave, the air inside was damp and cold, but it was shelter. Safe. For now. Darren eased Sela down against the rough stone wall, kneeling beside her. He grabbed his pack, pulling out his medkit. "All right," he said, forcing a smirk. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Sela huffed, her breath shallow. "I will live." "That's not exactly reassuring, sweetheart." She rolled her eyes. At least she still had the energy for that. Darren peeled back the makeshift bandage she had pressed to her leg. The wound was nasty, deep, but not fatal if treated. He grabbed a sterilizing spray and a wound sealer from his kit. "This is gonna sting," he warned. Sela bared her teeth. "Do it." Darren pressed the spray to her wound. Sela snarled, her fingers digging into the stone. The sound sent a shiver down his spine. But she didn't stop him. Darren worked quickly, sealing the wound as best he could. By the time he was finished, Sela's breathing had steadied, but her face was still pale under the dim light. He sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead. "There. Not bad for an amateur, huh?" Sela exhaled, her glowing eyes half-lidded. "You are tolerable." Darren smirked. "That's the nicest thing you've said to me." She didn't answer, just closed her eyes for a moment, her body relaxing against the cave wall. Darren let out a slow breath. The moment stretched between them, silent but not empty. Then his earpiece crackled. A voice, cold, mechanical, filtered through. "Human, we know you're listening." Darren's blood turned to ice. "The mercenaries." He glanced at Sela, but she hadn't moved. He stood, stepping away so she wouldn't hear, pressed a finger to his earpiece. "Yeah? Well, I'm kinda busy. Can I take a message?" A pause. Then, "Hand over the fugitive. You will not be harmed." Darren scoffed. "Right? Because I totally trust the guys who tried to shoot me." "You misunderstand, human." The voice was patient, cold. "You are not our target. She is. Her kind is dangerous. She must be eliminated." Darren's jaw clenched. He looked back at Sela. Her massive form slumped against the cave wall. The woman who had saved his life. The woman who had fought tooth and nail to survive. Not because she was a killer, but because she had no choice. Dangerous? Yeah. Maybe. But so was he. Darren took a slow breath. You want her? He murmured. Silence. Then, yes. Darren grinned. Then come and get her. And he cut the transmission. The final stand. The mercenaries came at dawn. Darren was ready. He had spent the last few hours setting traps. Makeshift explosives rigged from spare parts, motion-triggered flashbangs. Nothing fancy, but enough to slow them down. Sela had woken up an hour ago. Weak but determined. When Darren told her his plan, she had stared at him, unreadable. Then she had simply nodded. Now, as the mercenaries approached, Darren crouched behind cover, rifle steady. Sela stood beside him, her wound bandaged, her massive hands clenched into fists. They were outnumbered, outgunned. Didn't matter. They weren't running anymore. The first mercenary triggered a tripwire. An explosion rocked the cave entrance, sending debris flying. The mercs staggered, their visors flickering. Darren opened fire. Sela roared, charging forward like a force of nature. She grabbed the nearest soldier, lifting them off the ground and hurling them into the cave wall. Another merc turned to fire. Darren shot first, his plasma round slamming into their shoulder. The fight was brutal. Sela moved like a storm, her strength overwhelming. Darren covered her, picking off any stragglers that got too close. By the time the last mercenary fell, silence had returned. Darren panted, lowering his rifle. Sela stood over the bodies, her breath heavy, her glowing eyes burning. It was over. They had won. The departure. 2 days later, Darren stood outside his cabin, staring at the horizon. Sela stood beside him, healed enough to walk without pain. A ship, a stolen mercenary transport, waited behind them, its engines humming. She was leaving. And Darren? Darren had a choice. Stay on this rock. Live out the rest of his contract. Or go with her. He looked at her. At the woman who had gone from a shadow in the woods to something he couldn't imagine his life without. She turned to him, watching, waiting. Darren sighed. Yeah, all right, he muttered. Let's get the hell out of here. Sela smirked. And together, they stepped onto the ship, leaving the past behind. The stars awaited. And for the first time in years, Darren wasn't facing them alone.